Junia Zaidan, and I'm a professor of English and Applied Linguistics at the Federal University of Espírito Santo in Brazil. And today I'd like to talk about the spread of English and some ideas that may be relevant to anyone who is learning the language, or maybe who is teaching the language. Anyone who thinks about language and likes language. It's very interesting that everybody has something to say about language, because language is what constitutes us as individuals, and all of us usually are always very certain about things related to language, and that's very natural. And it's very important because we are always engaged in thinking about how language operates and how we learn, and we all have our personal theories about it. So in my personal life, I've always been interested in language and literature and learning foreign languages, and I learned English in Brazil. But I was always concerned with the fact that this language, which has spread to all continents of the world, had always been taught with a very strong bias towards certain countries and certain cultures. In other words, in Brazil, we usually learn English. I don't know if it's the case in your country or in your experience. We usually learn English, and we usually teach English in a way to reinforce either American or British standards. So this was something that puzzled me and led me to investigate and look at people's experiences with the language for my research. Some important data about English nowadays is that out of every 5 speakers of English in the world, only 2 will be so-called native speakers, like either from the UK or from the US or from New Zealand or Australia. So all these other speakers use English in very different ways from the standard speakers, for the most prestigious speakers of the language, varieties, as we say. So what are the implications? This is something that we could think about. So if this language, which has spread all over the world, is spoken by non-native speakers, I mean, they have outnumbered the native speakers, what are the implications? What are the consequences? How does this reflect on the language? I could say that the case of English specifically just exposes a principle that is universal to any other language, and English is showing us something that any other language could also show, which is language is dynamic, language is always changing, language is unpredictable, it's a wild horse that you can't control, and that is always affected by the people who use it. And without people, there wouldn't be language. So the speakers of a language are very important for this language to exist and for the way this language spreads. But the problem is that we sometimes don't consider, in the way we are taught, the way we are, the way we teach, the books that we read, sometimes we don't consider the fact that the spread of the language requires that we reconsider all the structures, all the norms, all the different mechanisms that regulate this language. What I'm saying is that when we have expectations about people's accent, like for some people to speak well is to speak like a certain native speaker, for example. For some people in Brazil, maybe I would think so. For some time ago, to speak English well would be to speak English like an American, like someone from the US. And then we have to understand that these norms, this what we call standard language ideology, is very far from being natural. It's very far from being what real life, what experience shows us. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is, through language, by establishing a standard, certain countries and certain cultures have control over all the processes of production or the resources in the world and over the speakers. So one of the ways which can be empowering to think about language and about teaching and about researching is to think about these traditional standards. And I can mention, for instance, American English, British English, RP English, which is the Queen's English. So these are standards which exist and which have performed a certain role in the history of the language and in the history of the countries. After all, countries only started to exist when languages were named. For a long time, language didn't have a name. So English with this name, and Portuguese and Italian, so these languages with names, they started to exist in order to establish the nation states some centuries ago. It's actually a recent thing. So one of the things that is nice for us to think about, and which I think will help us get rid of the burden of having to imitate someone, the burden of having to achieve a certain accent or the articulation of sounds in such and such ways. So one of the possibilities is to problematize all these structures, to take issue with the standards which have been established as the only possible way to really value diversity.